This is Unjourneying. I'm Mira Funk, licensed clinical social worker. And today I want to talk about the myth of Buddha's enlightenment and the implications of that for contemporary enlightenment seekers. So what I mean by that is, when I think back in my own life to the first time I ever encountered the story of the Buddha, the idea of Buddhism, it was probably in ninth grade. I think there was a history of the ancient world class or something like that. And there was a section on world religions. And I don't remember exactly how my textbook framed it, but my takeaway at that time as a young person was, wow, there's this person, Siddhartha Gautama, who recognized that life is suffering and that there is an escape. There is a secret cheat code. And he figured it out. He sat down under a Bodhi tree and he meditated until he got enlightened. And then he was just in this state of bliss for the rest of his life. And it's interesting to realize how much we distort things through our lenses, right? And I doubt my textbook was presenting it in quite that kind of a hyperbolic way, but that's how I read it. And it's understandable because at the time I was really suffering. And so the idea that there was somebody who had figured it out, who had escaped suffering, was very appealing. And it sunk deep into my consciousness and it stayed there. And I think was a very major driving force behind a lot of my spiritual seeking. I also encountered the story of Buddha in the work of Hermann Hesse, I think often just called Hermann Hesse in English, but I believe the German is more like Hermann Hesse. But his book, Siddhartha, which I read sometime in college, and obviously it's more of a fictionalized kind of account. But yeah, there was something, just the end of that book, I remember something about the river and Siddhartha, seeing the river and this metaphor of life as this river. Again, I'm probably distorting. I haven't read this book in years, but I just remember having this notion of some kind of serene, transcendent peace and bliss. And that to me was enlightenment. And I thought, wow, this guy figured it out. And if that's true, then that's what I want. That's what I want to do with my life, is to get that, to get enlightenment. I didn't even really question whether it was true or not. I just accepted the fact that it was historical fact, very uncritical, actually. And again, you see how it's easy to not be critical when you have a strong incentive to believe something. And so I do feel like there is this kind of received story, at least in my cultural context, being a Western person, of the story of the Buddha. And, most of us learn it somewhere along the way, but it usually goes something like, there was this guy, he was a prince, he saw that there was old age, sickness, and death, and he was very discouraged by this. So he went on this journey to enlightenment and went through various stages, worked with various teachers, did asceticism for a while, and then, eventually kind of went his own way, sat under a Bodhi tree, and then kaboom, he got the big E, the enlightenment, and that was it. He was done. He was happy and blissful and just floating on this cloud of serenity, until he passed away. And maybe that sounds really ridiculous to describe it that way, but I do feel strongly that that is how many, many people do think about Buddhism. And if I'm really honest, that's how I thought of the Buddha and Buddhism. And I think most of the people in my spiritual communities for many years, including my Buddhist communities within the Zen tradition that I was part of for about 15 years, I feel like that was, again, sort of the received wisdom and the understanding was that is, the story of the Buddha. And again, it's historical fact. And it's really interesting now as somebody in my 40s, trying to just deconstruct my beliefs and kind of just excavate, do this kind of archaeological dig into my past and these different belief systems that I grew into. And I've asked myself, why did I believe that? And is that true? And I was particularly inspired to do this kind of investigation, not only by my own just struggles along the way with enlightenment and this concept. But there's this particular podcast episode that I would highly recommend, and I'll link to it in the show notes. And it's called Masters of Oblivion. It's on the Deconstructing Yourself podcast with Michael Taft. The guest is Kenneth Folk. And Kenneth Folk is a very well-respected meditation teacher in the Theravada tradition. He studied under Mahasi Sayadaw. And he presents a really, really different picture of the Buddha that I thought sounds, in a way, much more accurate, perhaps. And even if it's not accurate, it's just fascinating. It just kind of turns everything on its head. And so what he says is, usually when, as Westerners, we see the term nirvana or nibbana as it's presented in the original Pali, the translation, as we imagine it, is a cosmic bliss out. This is how Kenneth describes it: cosmic bliss out, nirvana. And so that's the sense of just the Buddha was happy all the time, was eternally happy, was just blissed out all the time. And that is the essence of enlightenment. And what Kenneth says is, no, that's not at all what he's talking about. And he's saying we have to really look at the Buddha's historical and cultural context. And for the Buddha, in that context, there is a strong sense of the wheel of rebirth, right? The wheel of death and rebirth. So it is a cultural context that is dominated by a belief in reincarnation. And so, and this is, Kenneth's interpretation through the lens of his teachers. And again, not that this is some ultimate interpretation, but it's just a really interesting different take on the Buddha and Buddhism, especially the early Theravada tradition. So what Kenneth says is the Buddha essentially looked at human life and he said, this is horrible. This sucks. This is just inescapable torture. It is just old age, sickness, and death endlessly. And if I keep getting reborn, I'm just going to keep spinning around and around the wheel of karma, suffering endlessly forever. And so there has to be some kind of way out of here. There has to be some kind of way off this wheel. And Nibbana in that Pali tradition, that Theravada tradition, if you look at the word, it actually means kind of like a snuffing out or an extinguishing, right? And so the interpretation nowadays, at least within the communities I'm part of in meditation, is that we're really talking about not cosmic bliss out. We're talking about cessation. We're talking about nirodha. And for those of you who may not have heard of that, it's sort of a special moment or state. It's sort of a misnomer to call it a state, but it's a moment where consciousness drops out. And it can happen spontaneously, but it often happens in the course of rigorous meditation where the consciousness just kind of shuts down. And actually, there is more and more neuroscience research on this showing that there's some kind of drop-off in alpha waves preceding this. So it is a kind of neurological event where the brain just kind of shuts down, basically, and then reboots back up. And we would call that a cessation, nirodha, and it is in the Theravada tradition called nibbana, as Kenneth is describing it. And so the way Kenneth tells the story, he says the Buddha was looking for this solution of how to basically get off the wheel of rebirth. And he had this nibbana experience. That's what happened to him under the Bodhi tree. And basically, for him, it was almost like a little taste of oblivion. Aha, there was a moment when I did not effectively exist. I was not conscious. I was not here. And so then he kind of thought, well, perhaps if I train myself to get better and better and better at doing this, then when I die, I won't actually get reborn. I will just cease to exist. So this is the distinction between nibbana and parinibbana, or nirvana and parinirvana, as you would say in Sanskrit, the sort of relative cessation versus the final cessation at death, where it is just nothingness. So this is a very important difference because, again, as somebody who is suffering, who is craving bliss and happiness, I had this idea of, Buddhism is all about joy and peace and bliss in this life. And this interpretation, it's basically about oblivion. It's basically about the Buddha just saying, life sucks. I'm trying to figure out a way out of here to end it permanently, because if I don't, I'm just going to keep getting reborn. Maybe this cessation thing, this nibbana, is the kind of trick, in a sense, to get out of here. This is my exit strategy from the wheel of rebirth, from consciousness, from being itself into oblivion. So this is a really interesting because, yes, I think there's often this kind of very rosy picture of Buddhism in the West as a religion that's just all about peace and love. But in this interpretation, which is, it's just one interpretation, admittedly, and I'm not a Buddhist scholar, neither is Kenneth, and I'm sure Buddhist scholars would debate and say that there's many interpretations. That's the thing about historical figures like the Buddha, is that we don't really know exactly who they were because so much of what's written about them was written years after they died. And so it's always a construction, right? It's the same with Jesus or with Muhammad. Any great kind of religious figure, is so much of it is myth. And how do you separate the myth from the reality? It's so much of it is constructed. And so, but yeah, so this really turns things kind of on its head, because if Buddhism is not about joy and peace and freedom in this life, it's really about oblivion. It really makes things quite different because, yeah, especially I would say as a Western person who's more sort of secular, and I ultimately throw up my hands and say I don't know whether reincarnation is true or not. I consider myself an agnostic about so many things like that, because how can I ever say? But I'm definitely more inclined, with just the way I've been raised and my cultural conditioning and my biases, I'm definitely more inclined, admittedly, to think that when we die, that's it. It's just lights out forever, which is interesting because that means that just by virtue of my own cultural context and upbringing, I already kind of believe, in a sense, what the Buddha was hoping to attain with his whole project. So that means that when I die, I will essentially gain parinirvana automatically without having to do anything, which is interesting. So the Buddha's whole project of escape into oblivion, or just kind of complete lights out obliteration, only really is motivated within this reincarnation context. Without reincarnation, it's like, well, that's just how it is automatically. So why do you even need a religious or spiritual practice or meditation around that? So this is kind of interesting, but it definitely paints a much sort of darker picture of the early Buddha than you would think. And this is something that Kenneth talks about in the podcast. He says, the Buddha is not your friend. People think of the Buddha as this kind of rosy, loving figure who's all about peace and love, but really he was this kind of, at least in this interpretation, kind of hardcore, what would you say, almost like misanthrope, who's just like, this sucks, and I just want to, basically hit the light switch, so I just go out, and I go out forever. And so if you think of early Buddhism, you could almost think of it as this kind of oblivion cult that's just kind of training people to turn off their brains so they have this nirvana experience, this nibbana experience, lights out, so that they're training for the final lights out, so that they can just poof, like disappear into oblivion. So this is a really interesting kind of different take on Buddhism. And again, we can't say that this is the true or ultimate one, but it's very compelling, and I think it does align with a lot of the Pali Canon. And this is what the lineage that Kenneth received within Mahasi Sayadaw's tradition. And there's a lot of consensus, I would say, among a lot of contemporary Buddhist meditators, including the host of this particular podcast episode I'm referring to, Michael Taft. There is this kind of alignment that, yes, like early Buddhism seems like it was all about how can we make ourselves disappear, and how can we just get off this cycle of rebirth. So if that's what Nirvana was to the Buddha, it was disappearance, it was oblivion. It raises a lot of interesting questions, because then you might wonder, well, why have we come in the West to think of nirvana as the bliss out, as Kenneth describes, the cosmic bliss out? And why do we even use this word enlightenment? And so it's kind of interesting. I tried to dig into this a little bit. I'm not saying this is any kind of complete history, but it seems like this term nirvana, or in some cases perhaps like bodhi or awake, was translated as enlightenment by a lot of Western scholars because they were trying to map it onto the European ideas of enlightenment. And that was sort of the closest analog they had, within this cultural context. But somehow that word enlightenment, it feels like it has gathered over the years, almost snowballed into this kind of ball of like fairy dust where it just feels very magical. And there is this kind of mythos that has emerged around this idea of enlightenment, some kind of final state of bliss where there is no suffering, there is only peace, and you are almost like a god, walking upon the earth. You have beat the game of life, and you are done. You are enlightened, and that is not at all what the Buddha was talking about. It's not actually in alignment with Buddhism at all. It's sort of the opposite. I mean, the Buddha was basically saying that's not possible. That's why I'm trying to get out of here. And, again, going back to my childhood, and I have to ask myself, well, why when I first read about in this textbook about, Buddhism, did I really amplify this element of salvation so much? And I think it has to do with a lot of cultural conditioning, and I think, in particular, this kind of craving to escape suffering, right? I think that's very much wired in humans in general. There is this kind of drive we have to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But I think especially within my cultural context, I can say as a Northern American white person, within America, within this kind of puritanical tradition that we're part of here, there's such a strong Christian and salvific and soteriological and the current of salvation runs very strongly. And of course, I was raised as a Christian as well, so I have that too. Kind of hammered into my DNA, my epigenetics, my conditioning. And so, I think that there is something just so tantalizing about this idea of escape, not escape in terms of oblivion, but escape in terms of, wow, like escape you can actually experience, an actual personal cash out, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and that being enlightenment. And so I think that this is very, very common. I think that people are deeply suffering. And so when there is some kind of possibility presented that there is somebody out there who has transcended it, and they tell you, and you can do it too, it's really hard to put that idea aside. It's really hard to let it go. It's just so, so compelling. And I know for me, for many, many years, I was deeply, deeply invested in that. And I've started calling this particular framing of spirituality Sellvation, a sort of portmanteau word of salesmanship, selling, and salvation. Because what I think happens is that this human drive to seek pleasure and avoid pain is so strong that I think a lot of meditation teachers out there exploit that, and they exaggerate their own experience, and in their marketing materials, on their websites, and on YouTube, and so forth and so on, they present this rosy vision of, if you follow me, if you do my coaching courses, if you come to my retreats, et cetera, you will attain enlightenment, you will attain awakening, and you will be free of suffering. And I don't feel like I'm exaggerating. I mean, this kind of language is ubiquitous. I feel like within the spiritual field, on so many YouTube channels, so many websites, there is an end of suffering this lifetime. You will attain timeless wonder or infinite freedom, or unconditional love, et cetera, all these terms are thrown around. And of course, it's super effective. Of course, thousands of people are really eager to sign up and subscribe to that and pay for it and go to these retreats because, I mean, who doesn't want that, right? Like, it's very, very deeply embedded. And so, but I think it's very toxic, ultimately. That's kind of the conclusion that I've come to, having lived in that state for many years, having worked with teachers who teach in that way, gone to retreats where it's framed that way, been part of spiritual communities where everybody's chasing after enlightenment. It is very corrosive, I would say, spiritually. And ironically, it actually keeps you seeking because you're always after that perfected state. And so instead of actually plugging into your direct experience, there is this kind of constant chasing of something that you'll never get to. And so, it is kind of a deep, deep irony that the craving for enlightenment is perhaps one of the greatest spiritual blocks at actually just embracing your experience as it is. And actually opening into something that we might call a more authentic awakening, which I can talk more about later. So that's kind of the inspiration and the framing for this particular episode, starting with the Buddha. And then what I want to do next is talk about myths of enlightenment in more detail and kind of go through them systematically and debunk them. Because what I want to communicate here is that nobody has ever been enlightened, ever. Maybe that sounds like an extreme statement. And I have to explain what I mean there with a little footnote. What I mean is, if we're defining enlightenment in this capital E sense as this final perfect state where there's no suffering, there's no, sort of like in any way suffering that is dependent on the body and the decay and the breakdown of physical systems or neurology and things like that, or in no way is there some kind of suffering that arises from really difficult life circumstances. I don't see evidence that anybody in history has ever attained this. And I think it's really easy when you're an enlightenment seeker to say, well, what about this person? What about that person? What about, Adyashanti? Surely Adyashanti has attained enlightenment. Or, name your favorite spiritual teacher. And, what I found time and time again is that, never meet your heroes, they say, because what I found along the way is every single person that I thought was enlightened in this sense, when I actually got to know them, they were inevitably, human. And, some of you may know Adyashanti, and I'm not saying this to betray any confidence, because he has made this quite public, is that actually he's been suffering very deeply for many years. It turns out there was some kind of issue with his deodorant, and I think aluminum in the deodorant that caused some kind of allergic reaction that caused chronic pain. And the reaction to that caused, some kind of post-traumatic stress. And so, I really actually applaud him for being so vulnerable and sharing that with his community, because I think Adyashanti is a perfect example of somebody who is a figure really ripe for this kind of projective dynamics, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many communities I've been part of and conversations I've been part of where people have upheld Adyashanti as one of the living Buddhas, right? Like an example of somebody who has really attained a life that is deeply free of suffering. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, he was deeply suffering for decades. And it's interesting he took so long to disclose it. And I think part of that is because there is, I think, this kind of dynamic locks both the seekers but also the teachers into this process, because the teachers also know, if they're honest and they sort of, if the jig is up, right? if they say my feet are made of clay and I suffer too, then they know to a certain extent that their students might just follow somebody else, right? Who's still continuing that Sellvation, as I call it, cycle, right? So I say this not in judgment. I say this with compassion, just understanding that it's very complicated, and this drive to escape suffering and to dangle this kind of carrot that there is an escape from suffering possible is just very, very strong. And I think teachers get caught up in it. I think students get caught up in it. And this is part of my motivation for sharing this, is I'm trying to generate more authentic and honest conversations about awakening so that we can help try to break this cycle. So, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying that awakening is not possible. Some of this is obviously semantics, right? It depends on how you define these things. All I'm really saying is that if we're defining enlightenment as this final bliss out state, that doesn't seem to be true for anybody. I could be wrong, but I've never encountered anyone who, when I really get to know them behind the scenes, is in this state. And anybody who claims that, I find that behind the scenes, I get to know them or get to know people who get to know them in their communities. There's often a lot of harm done, a lot of spiritual bypassing, a lot of lies, a lot of manipulation going on. So I encourage people, be wary, be skeptical. If a teacher that you're working with is telling you, I don't have a self, I don't suffer, I don't have any kind of ordinary human experience, I don't have any ordinary emotions, I would encourage you to be skeptical, because chances are they're probably bypassing and they're probably repressing a lot of stuff behind the scenes, and that's going to come out in some kind of way. So enlightenment in that sense, the capital E enlightenment, I think, is a myth. And that's why I titled this episode that Buddha was never enlightened. Now, you could say, did Buddha have an awakening? I'm distinguishing awakening from enlightenment in this sense. Again, this is semantics. And I would say, is awakening in the sense of having some kind of non-dual opening, having, yes, some kind of cessation event where that transforms your relationship with the reality, your perceptions, where you do perceive some of these non-dual qualities of openness or interconnectedness. Yes, absolutely. I can speak from experience. That definitely happened to me. And it definitely changed my just ordinary operating system of how I show up in life and how life feels to me. And it's also not a cosmic bliss out. It's also not an escape from suffering. It includes suffering as well. So that's what I want to really distinguish, is if we're defining enlightenment as an end to suffering, I want to say that I don't think that exists. I'm deeply skeptical of that. I think it is a very powerful and enduring myth. Is it possible to have a shift in your perception and your identity that can be deeply transformative, that can, yes, reduce suffering? Absolutely. Is that the goal, to reduce suffering? Well, I'll talk more about that later. I think it's a little more complicated than that. We'll get there. But anyway, what I want to do is move on in this episode to talking about different myths of enlightenment and debunking those. So one myth of enlightenment is that you are happy all the time, that you have no negative emotions whatsoever. And that may sound, again, like an exaggeration, but these are things that people actually do claim. I mean, I've heard people on YouTube, on podcasts, talking about their experience, saying, I have no negative states, saying that this experience of being is like heaven. There is no suffering. There is no self. It is just a river of bliss. I have no anxiety. I have no fear. I have nothing like that. And in particular, this term, happiness independent of conditions, that seemed to be a term that was in popular currency, I don't know, back in like 2015 or something like that. It felt like there were several teachers saying happiness independent of conditions. So, is this true? Are there people who are happy all the time? Again, I cannot say for sure. I don't have infinite knowledge of the universe and of every person on the planet. I can't be inside people's experience. But this certainly does not seem to be true in my experience. Certainly not true in my personal experience. That's just an N of one. But anyone that I've talked to who has really devoted decades of their life to this awakening process and to personal development will, when they're honest, say, yeah, of course I still suffer. Of course I'm still human. And they'll say the same thing about their mentors and other people in their community. It's just, this is part of our human experience. We have a full spectrum of emotions, and it's just part of nature. And I actually think it's really unhealthy to imagine being happy all the time. I mean, how strange would that be, actually? I mean, imagine if you lost a loved one and went to their funeral and you were just there smiling and laughing, happy. Like, how bizarre is that? I mean, our emotions are part of our social fabric. It's part of connecting. It's part of, it's also just so, it's such a limiting view of human life and emotions to think that certain emotions are negative and that they shouldn't exist. I mean, what's wrong with sadness? What's wrong with fear? These are just textures, like energetic textures that come through our experience. And they're not problems. They're like listening to different stations of music on the radio or something like that. And happiness independent of conditions. That's a really interesting phrase as well, especially because I find that people who claim that, when you look at their biography, there often seem to be very, very special conditions that created or gave rise to their supposed enlightenment. I try not to name too many names here, but I'm thinking of folks who were on like trust funds and were able to spend many years meditating in Asia, usually like white cis men, usually living in political freedom and states like the U.S. Where they're not experiencing oppression or war that's affecting them, in some kind of direct personal way, and they are also, it's some kind of high, socioeconomic status. And so all of those things are actually incredibly special conditions that create a generally peaceful, happy life, by and large, compared to many other demographics you could look at globally. You could look at people living in great poverty and like slums in different parts of the world who are facing so much disease and oppression and just daily struggle. And so to say that within those very particular conditions that are highly conducive to peace already, that you have attained to happiness independent of conditions, I think is it's suspect, I would say. And I often wonder when somebody claims that, how far would you be willing to push that? I mean, would you? Yeah, I mean, what would happen if you lost your job? If you had lost your loved ones? If you had suddenly were faced with chronic health problems? Would that happiness independent of conditions still persist, or would you experience the normal range of human emotions? Would you experience moments of fear or doubt or insecurity? And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with just being a human being, right? So I think so much of this, what I struggle with this idea of enlightenment is it seems like such a spiritual bypass, such a denial of just really deep, intimate parts of our humanity. And that's why I'm really critiquing it here, to be honest. I think it's a very corrosive idea, and I think it's time within spirituality for this idea of enlightenment in this sense, the way I'm defining it, in this kind of perfectionistic sense, to fall away. It's time for us to deconstruct it and let go of it and come into a more authentic, immanent, and honest experience of spirituality. So moving down through these different myths of enlightenment that I want to debunk, another would be having no fear of death. Again, these are things people claim. I don't have any fear of death whatsoever. And I'm deeply skeptical of this. And I sometimes think to myself, well, we could test this. If somebody claimed this, I have no fear of death, how about we strap a heart rate monitor to them and then hire an actor to jump out of the bushes, with a fake knife or something like that, and see if their heart rate spikes, or would they just be completely calm and serene? I would bet good money that if somebody were really surprised with a physical threat to their safety like that, if their heart rate didn't show that, I think it's pretty suspicious if somebody's saying they have no fear of death whatsoever. And I think we could actually measure that empirically. And interestingly, there are people who do have a calcification of the amygdala. This is actually a neurological disorder where their amygdala, which is in many ways we consider the seat of fear within the brain, is calcified, and so it stops working. And so their fear of death is greatly diminished, perhaps not completely gone, but greatly diminished. And what's interesting is that it actually becomes a liability for them. I once heard this podcast a long time ago. I think it was Invisibilia maybe, but I can't remember. But anyway, it was about this woman who had this disorder where she had a calcified amygdalas, and she actually got into many dangerous situations in her life because if she'd be walking down a street at night and there would be somebody who would be suspicious nearby, instead of having a normal fear reaction that would tell you, oh, I should walk the other way, or this isn't a safe situation, or if somebody would approach her and strike up a conversation with her in an attempt to kind of manipulate her, deceive her, instead of having some of those warning reactions in her body, she would just be easily deceived. Right? And so it actually was very harmful for her to not have fear. So again, this points to this picture that these emotions that we think of in this enlightenment model of cosmic bliss out as negative or as bad are actually just like important pieces of information. It's part of our sort of like human internal GPS system. And so, yeah, this whole idea of I don't fear death, I don't have any fear, it's just unrealistic. It's impossible unless you have some kind of neurological disorder, and it's just not healthy. And what's wrong with being afraid of death? Also, I mean, this is all kind of relative on a sliding scale. Like, yes, I think if somebody has a deep, contracted fear of death that's keeping them really stuck in their life, yeah, okay, that's very limiting, and that's where work with meditation and with psychedelics like 5-MeO-DMT can be really helpful to kind of release the parking brake on that. But having some kind of fear of death is just normal. It's just healthy. I mean, this is what helps keep us alive. It's what helps keep us safe. And again, it's just another texture of human experience. It's nothing to deny or repress or cut off. Another myth that I think is very, very common of enlightenment that I encounter is this notion of having no self whatsoever. This is very, very common. You've probably heard this before. Many different podcasts, YouTube videos out there, people just claim, I have no self at all. The self has completely dropped away, zero self, and so I have zero suffering. Does that really make sense? to me, it doesn't make any sense, actually. And first of all, it's like, practically speaking, how could you function without a self? I mean, how could you recognize yourself in the mirror? How could you chop onions and, know where the boundary of the onion is and that boundary of your finger is? You don't accidentally chop your finger off, right? It's like, it's very, very important and healthy and normal to have a conventional boundary of the self. I think that what people mean is that they're seeing through the self as a kind of construction. They're not holding the self so tightly. They're not as attached to it. They're not centering it as much. They're not rigidified as much around the sense of self. But this idea of no self whatsoever is just, it just doesn't make any sense. It's kind of, it reminds me of, within like social construction theory, you might say something like, well, stop sign is a social construction, right? At some point in history, stop signs did not exist. They were invented. They were, they proliferated around the country and the world, and then they became stop signs. And then we were habituated into using them. And so, of course, stop signs are empty in the Buddhist sense. They are constructions. They don't have any original essence. But does that mean that they don't exist? Does that mean that when you see one, you just blaze right through it because, well, it's just a construction? No, of course not. It still functions. You still understand it, right? It's a stop sign. So this is, to me, what it means to see through the self as a construction, is that you're no longer sort of taking it as seriously. You understand it as a construction, but it doesn't mean that you don't use it to function. I mean, it's just like language or anything. I mean, yeah, it's a construction. And, I actually want to take the position, this may sound a little bit controversial, but I'm gonna double down on it, that I actually think the ego and the self are wonderful, beautiful things. I'm actually very like pro-self, pro-ego. I'm really not in the no-self camp when it comes to spirituality. And the way I think about this is with the analogy of trees. Okay, so if you're looking out your window and you see a tree, right? Now, from a certain perspective, scientifically, philosophically, you could argue that your perception of the tree, utter bullshit, utter fabrication, utter illusion. Because if you could see through a different kind of lens, you would just see that it's all just electromagnetic energy. There's no separation between anything. And just understanding even the biology of tree networks and mycorrhizal networks, and then also the exchange of gases at the level of the leaves and the stoma of the leaves, and everything is just interconnected, right? So the fact that you look out and your brain constructs this separate object that's a tree that is somehow separate from all these other networks of energy and matter that it's part of is, from one perspective, an error, a philosophical error. It is a mistake. It is an illusion, right? And I can recognize that, right? But then to say, okay, so let's take that to its conclusion and say, well, now I'm no longer going to see trees, or trees are bad, or my experience of trees is that they don't exist. I don't see trees at all. They're just not there. That's just not a thing. Nobody is like that. And that's okay, because actually I think it's actually quite, it's just, just as it's amazing that you can meditate and take psychedelics and have temporary experiences where everything does kind of dissolve into fractals or just feelings of nothingness or spaciousness or something like that, or you can have ego deaths or cessations and things like that. It's, in a way, the flip side of the coin is it's just as amazing that the human mind can take out of the raw material of consciousness all this information and make this object, a tree. Sure, it's an illusion, and it's also a really interesting, cool, and beautiful one that we can simultaneously appreciate that the tree is a construct, that it is empty, that it is not separate from everything else in the universe, that's made of stardust, et cetera, et cetera. That's part of the, Earth's internet, as Paul Stamets says, the mycorrhizal, mycelial networks under the ground. And also, I can see it as a separate object that's a tree. And there's nothing wrong with that. Trees are beautiful, right? So this is how I think of the self. Yes, the self philosophically, analytically, you can deconstruct it. It is empty, right? But that doesn't mean that it's somehow bad or you don't experience it. It is necessary to function. And I think the path, the middle way, you might say, in Buddhism is how can we appreciate the construction, the constructed nature, the empty nature of the tree of the self, right? And also cultivate its function at the same time, right? So how can something that is empty, just like using language, like words are empty, words are made up, we can use them effectively. So that becomes the kind of balance point of form and emptiness, is how can you have a self and also realize its emptiness simultaneously in this kind of dreamlike nature of being. That, to me, again, is distinguishing awakening from enlightenment. So can that happen with awakening, with non-dual awakening? Yeah, sure, absolutely. You can see through the nature of yourself as a construction. And that can be part of your shifted perception. Do you have then an experience where there's zero self whatsoever, this absolute is no self? No, that's just not a thing. It just doesn't make any sense. And again, people who claim this, and there are people out there who claim this, again, you get to know them behind the scenes. There's quite a lot of self happening, I will say, in my experience with some of these teachers. There's often a lot of narcissism, a lot of manipulation, a lot of bypassing, and a lot of shadow work that just hasn't been done. So yeah, if you hear somebody say that, be skeptical. And, give yourself a break, right? That's the thing. I have so many people come into my practice and they're like, I still feel like I have a self and I want to experience no self. I want to have no self. And I have so much compassion for these people, because I think what's happening is they actually feel a lot of maybe self-hatred or heaviness or shame around themselves. And the idea of getting rid of themselves is so appealing. But actually what's needed is not to get rid of the self. That's impossible anyway. It's actually to embrace all of those different parts, right? And to actually feel them and to do some deep inner child and shadow work healing of all these different parts of yourself, so that you can see it all as a construction, right? So you can feel it energetically as lighter and not treat it as something so heavy that needs to be expunged or removed, right? Another myth of enlightenment that's out there is this notion of seeing things as they are. So this is often, I think, present in the term like ground of being or true nature, or sometimes there are terms out there like reality with no filters or unmediated reality. So there is this kind of presumption that when you have a non-dual awakening or shift, that you are actually seeing bare metal reality, that you somehow have direct access. You're plugging into reality with a capital R or capital T truth. And again, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's true. I can't say for sure. But my experience tells me that that's fairly unlikely. It's also just not really in alignment with neuroscience. Neuroscience, the latest theories tell us within predictive processing that actually all of our experience is story. All of our experience is belief all the way down. It's a hierarchical process. But even if you feel like you are experiencing just the textures of sensation, it's still a prediction that your brain is making about what it thinks is there. You don't have actually access to the direct material reality, if that exists. Again, these are kind of ontological philosophical arguments that aren't resolved. But I just want to say that I think that that presumption is a big one. It's a very strong claim. And I recognize why people say that. I think when you shift into a kind of non-dual awakening, because so much of the mind chatter falls away and so many of the assumptions you've been carrying fall away, and there is more of a lively and fresh contact with sensory experience, it's easy to feel like, oh, this is it. This is reality. But then my follow-up question is well, why? How do you know that? Just because it feels true doesn't mean necessarily that it is true. Right. And so we can look to neuroscience and say, okay, we think what's happening here is that there are these high level priors, these beliefs, this activity of the default mode network that's overactive, that is tuning down, and then it's sort of down regulating, and then there's sort of this precision weighting that's going on, where there's more of a higher weighting of sensory phenomena in a less kind of constructed, a more dereified kind of state, and so more of these bottom-up kind of signals are coming up into your brain, basically your cortex is getting more bottom-up signaling that is more a direct kind of feed-forward signal from sensory perception. It's not like a direct, you can't directly plug into your senses. It's always a construction, but there is this kind of contact with more of these prediction errors that's happening, instead of just always dwelling in this kind of canned version of reality of predicting what you think is there, in terms of your beliefs, right? So it feels more sensorially fresh and sort of, in a sense, shocking and vivid and surprising in that sense. And it feels very real and true, but I don't think there's any real absolute reason or basis for saying that it is the ultimate reality. Yeah, I think to another component that I want to unpack with these myths of awakening, of enlightenment, in the sense that I'm defining it, is the sense of having no preferences or distinctions. And this is coming from this ancient Zen text, the Xinxin Ming, as it's often called. And there's this famous quote from this Zen patriarch that says, "The great way is difficult for those who do not make distinction, or for those who do not have preferences." So if you read that and you take that to heart, you might think, oh, okay, so enlightenment means a kind of state where I do not have any kind of personal preferences, and I do not make any kind of distinctions, like whatsoever. And again, there are people out there who claim that they don't. They have this completely just undifferentiated experience of being, and they don't distinguish between any kind of dualities or me and you or self and other. And again, I find this highly suspect. I think it's very extreme. It's very absolutist. How can you get through life if you can't look in the mirror and know that you're you and that you're different from somebody else? This is just how we navigate our life. And also, it's again, it's just like an ordinary human experience to have preferences, to have distinctions. And the idea that we could somehow eliminate those is a fallacy. Can these distinctions be softened? Can you see that in your visual field, the lines that supposedly separate different objects are all part of this seamless fabric of visual experience? Yeah, absolutely, that can happen. Again, this is what I would describe as a kind of awakening process. But that Capital-E Enlightenment of there being no distinctions, I just find that to be a great exaggeration. And something that I'll get into at various points in this episode is you can prove this actually empirically by subjecting people to various neuropsychological tools and assessments. I think the most interesting one for this kind of work is the implicit association tests. And you can actually find these online. I'll actually link to them in the show notes. If you go to Harvard's implicit association test website, there's all these different tests. I'm not going to get into all the details about the methodology because it's kind of complicated, but basically it measures how biased you are, especially towards certain demographic groups. And so if you are, nobody can escape their socialization. And we are all socialized with certain biases in favor of certain social groups and against other social groups. And even if those conflict with our explicit beliefs, there is still that implicit bias that's happening under the hood. And so, some of these categories are bias against LGBTQ people, or bias against people of color, or bias against Muslims. There's all sorts of different categories. And if you go through these tests, it's really, really interesting because nobody gets a perfect score, right? If you go through all the tests, there might be some people who get a very even score on a few of them, but if you go through all of them, you will reveal that you do have these hidden biases. Even myself, like as a queer identified person, I have implicit bias against queer people. And I can actually feel that, that's because that's how I was raised. I was raised in a culture of homophobia my whole life. I can also feel that I have bias against people of color, which is tragic. And it's completely in conflict with my values. I'm married to a person of color. My kid is a person of color. And yet that bias is still there, and you can measure it. You can see your results when you do these tests. And so that is just part of being human. Being human is we are conditioned with biases, with distinctions. We do separate self and other. We do judge different groups, different racial groups, different socioeconomic groups, and according to sexual orientation, sexuality, gender, et cetera, et cetera. And these tests show that. And so the idea that you could actually have no preferences or distinctions, according to the Xinxin Ming, and some kind of definition of enlightenment is, again, it's not empirically true. It's not human. It's impossible. So I think it's important to move the goalposts back a little bit, because this idea of an enlightenment that is so perfect, so transcendent, is only just causing more seeking. Right? It's part of that Sellvation dynamic, as I explained earlier. Another enlightenment myth is having no thoughts. Having no thoughts whatsoever. There are people who claim this. believe it or not. And again, it seems to be ridiculous. It seems to be impossible. Is there a reduction in thoughts? Absolutely. I've experienced that. I feel like my thought stream is much less sticky and noisy than it was years ago. And it's not experienced as much as a problem. It's much more just like watching rain falling than it is like playing this intense Tetris game, trying to solve my thoughts. But do I have no thoughts? Absolutely not. And again, what's the problem with thoughts? Thoughts are just part of your sensory experience. There is a teacher out there, Gary Weber, who really is an advocate of the no thoughts model of enlightenment. But what's really interesting is actually if you look at some of his materials, what he'll say in the fine print is, if I'm remembering correctly, I think he says, I have no thoughts about 90% of the time, except when I'm tired or have low blood sugar. So I was thinking, oh, that's interesting, 90% of the time. So if he's awake, let's say 16 hours, 10% of that, so that's like 1.6 hours of thinking a day. And then you add in, low blood sugar, tiredness, just a rough ballpark. He's probably averaging maybe 2 hours of thinking per day. So it's interesting to put that in perspective. So even the person who's claiming no thoughts, who's the big no thoughts guy, is still saying, yeah, and I still think about 2 hours a day. So anyway, I hope that kind of helps ground things. And and I hope it doesn't sound like I'm making these ad hominem kind of critiques of people. I'm just reporting what Gary Weber himself is saying about his experience. I'm just trying to keep it real, basically, with enlightenment, with awakening, because I think it's just so tragic when people hold themselves to these impossible standards. Because if you go through your path and you're thinking, I have to have no thoughts, oh my God, I mean, you're going to be miserable, right? Because you're actually denying just your natural human experience. It's like, just like your heart beats, your mind will think. That's what it does. It's a natural process. And so it's just about transforming your relationship with your thoughts so that they are experienced more as sensory textures. It's not about getting rid of them. It's not about cutting them off. And even Gary Weber still has thoughts, right? So give yourself a break. Another feature of enlightenment that's often touted is centerlessness. Centerlessness. This is very commonly claimed. I know what people mean by that. There is a way that we intuitively center ourselves, especially behind our eyes. There's a sense of a locus of selfing and attention that is there. And part of the non-dual shift in perception, absolutely, is a kind of loosening of that knot, that kind of bolus of selfing and attention that feels like it's behind there. That's very tight and contracted. Can that loosen up? Absolutely. I would say that is part of the kind of non-dual awakening process. Now, is there an absolute radical centerlessness where you experience no center? And I would say no. Again, I would say that is an exaggeration. And anybody who's claiming that is exaggerating their experience, either consciously or unconsciously, and it's part of that Sellvation dynamic. It is strategic. If you claim that, you are always going to seem better or superior than your followers, and they will always keep paying for your services because they want to get where you are, because you're always moving the goalposts beyond where they can get to. Rick Archer from Buddha at the Gas Pump, Bad Gap, I've heard him critique this in a really clever way where he says, okay, if you say that you don't have a self, or if you have no center or something like that, what if I were to tell you I have a hammer and I could either hit this rock or I could hit your knee? What would be your preference, right? And of course, what he's pointing out there is, of course, people are going to say, no, please don't hit my knee, hit the rock instead. And, he's bringing it into real world experience, right? If someone claims no center, no self, no preferences, we can say, well, obviously, if they're going to, they're not going to want you to hit their kneecap with a hammer, right? So that means that they have a self, they have a center, they have preferences. And somehow the rock is seeming less centered than their knee is, right? Because it belongs to them. There is some sense of belonging that's online. And to not have that would be pathological. A similar theme flows into this concept of agency or doership. So many people claim that they have no sense of a doer, they have no agency at all. And that's just part of enlightenment. And what I would say is that, again, to kind of ground this in real experience and to speak in a more balanced way about it, there can be a more spontaneity that happens in your experience. So when you are just taking a walk, can feel, in a sense, that the feet are walking themselves, right? Or when you're breathing, the breath is happening on its own. But is it to the extent that there is zero sense of agency or doership? And again, I would say no, not in my personal experience. And I think the strongest argument against the existence of that is the fact that, or as an experience of enlightenment, is that there are actually neurological disorders where people do have so little sense of agency that it becomes a huge problem, right? So one of these is alien hand syndrome. This is something that happens to split brain patients where they might have, their two hands might be acting spontaneously, independently, and in fact in conflict with one another. So I've read about a patient once where one of his hands was buttoning his shirt and the other was swatting the hand away, trying to not button the shirt or trying to fight him. So that's an example of alien hand syndrome where he actually felt like no sense of control over his hand whatsoever, no sense of agency. And what does that lead to? It is a pathology, right? It is a neurological disorder, alien hand syndrome. And surely that's not what people are talking about when they're talking about enlightenment. They're talking about a relaxing of agency, a relaxing of doership, more of a sense of spontaneity. Another really illuminating neurological condition is athymormia. So athymormia is a disorder of the brain that is a disorder of sort of will or motivation. And so I've read a patient account once of somebody who was at the beach and the sun was beating down on them and they got 3rd-degree sunburns, I believe, and ended up in the ER. And the doctor asked them, why did you not seek shade or seek relief? And what the patient said was, well, the burning sensations on my skin felt no different than any other sensations at the beach, the sound of the waves or the sound of the birds, the feeling of the sand. And so I felt no motivation to save myself, right, to seek relief. So this would be an example of somebody who has no sense of agency, no sense of doership, no sense of boundaries, no sense of preferences. It can happen, but that is a neurological, pathological condition. That is not what we would describe as a kind of functional awakening. So when people in enlightenment circles say they have no sense of doership, challenge it. They don't have athymormia. They're not talking about pathology. All they're talking about, from where I'm sitting, is just some kind of relaxation of the sense of doership. And there's no reason that free will, even if it is an illusion, which it probably is, it seems that it is, needs to be eliminated. It's just part of our experience, just like having our emotions. The feeling of will is something that arises. When I take salvia, sometimes the feeling of will temporarily ceases and goes away, and then it comes back. So you can see it again as a construction. It's just like the tree. It's just like the self. You see through it as a construction. It doesn't mean you have to eliminate it. I don't think you can anyway, not in any functional sense. And it's not a problem. Just don't take it so seriously. That's all this is about. And moving on to the next item. So let's talk about freedom. Freedom is a word that is bandied about a lot in enlightenment circles, a lot. I feel like it's one of those big marketing keywords. Eternal freedom, endless freedom, infinite degree freedom, freedom forever. You can encounter this all the time on YouTube channels and podcasts and websites that are about enlightenment, awakening, psychedelics to a certain extent as well. And I was thinking about this, that I can't help but bring a social justice lens to this as a licensed clinical social worker. And I'm reminded of the quote from Fannie Lou Hamer, who was this civil rights activist here in the United States. And what she said was, nobody's free until everybody's free. Nobody's free until everybody's free. I think that's a very powerful and very compelling statement. And I think it connects very deeply to what I was saying earlier about the implicit association tests. So because of my socialization, these implicit biases, what that means is as I navigate through the world, I'm constantly judging people. And I can feel this, it's not in alignment with my values. It would be great if I didn't have these judgments, but I totally do. As I go through the world, I see somebody who's poor, or I see, even as a queer person, and when I see other queer people, or when I see people of color, as a white person, there is something in me. I've been so deeply socialized that there's some kind of bias or judgment that arises in me. And, we would call that like internalized dominance in a kind of social justice framework. The flip side of that coin is internalized oppression. I experience that too. Internalized oppression is, as a gender nonconforming person, I experience shame around my gender because I've been socialized to think that it is pathological, it is evil, it is deviant, et cetera, et cetera. So I experienced, in some ways, the whole spectrum of that. Like I experienced like the internalized oppression, at least in that aspect of my identity. And also experienced internalized dominance, where I've been socialized to think I'm like better in some ways than other people. It's toxic, but it's also part of me, right? It's like been baked in. And I can do a lot of work to acknowledge that, to try to reduce it, to try to live my values in ways that I'm not, acting out those biases, to be aware of them and to not reinforce them. But they're still there. I don't think they can be completely uprooted. And so what that means is that I am not free, right? It means that I'm not free because in my heart, I am having this spiritually corrosive experience of thinking that some people are worse than I am, or I'm better than some other people just because of my, accident of birth, because of my identities, because of my socioeconomic status, because I am, middle class and, the person on the street is poor, and maybe some judgment arises in me because of how I was socialized within, especially my, conservative family. Growing up in Texas, there's like so much judgment there about people who are in conditions of, houselessness and so forth. And if I carry even the sliver of bias there, which these implicit association tests can reveal, that means that I'm carrying something in my heart that is separation, right? It is centering. I am the center. They are the margins. That means that I am not spiritually free. That is actually a kind of suffering that I carry, is that I carry this internalized dominance. So that's why I love this civil rights quote from Fannie Lou Hamer, that nobody's free until everybody's free, because I think it has so many implications, not only for social justice and political kind of movements, but also for spirituality. That this idea that like an individual is free and enlightened it's so individualistic. Because how could you, and I'm thinking of, again, these people who claim happiness independent of conditions as a straight white cis man who's living in America, who, has a high SES. How could you be 100% free when there's so many people that are in conditions of oppression that help create that life for you, whether that's, your housekeeper or, the people working in sweatshops making your clothes, or, making your electronics, in factories in Asia and things like that under really unhealthy conditions. All of that are these conditions of inequality that actually, lead to forms of internalized dominance that are, I would say, corrosive to the soul. They are, I don't necessarily believe in a soul per se. I'm just using that kind of poetically, but I think they are forms of suffering. I think we carry the weight of that. I know I do. And it is a form of suffering, right? So how can you be free unless everybody was free? If everybody were free, then we would not be socialized with these biases. You would not look at, well, first of all, our society would be completely restructured. We would have a utopia. This is very fantastical. If there were no people who were unhoused, no people who are poor, no people who are oppressed, within that fantasy, then yes, you might be socialized into a utopian world where you don't actually have snap judgments about people's identities. Then you might say, I'm free in that sense. You don't have implicit biases. It's a fantasy, right? It's a fantasy. It's never going to happen. It's a nice idea. But yeah, so this idea that you can be individualistically free, I think, is deeply flawed. It's very problematic. And so I don't usually talk about freedom in that sense. Then we get to eternalism. So eternalism is some kind of belief in something eternal, life after death, some kind of enduring self. Ironically, even though you might say no self, I come across this a lot in non-duality. And in particular, I'm thinking of a video that I found. I once was just curious and I got on YouTube and I asked myself, what is the most popular non-duality YouTube video? Just kind of curious what's really resonating with people. So I searched non-duality and then did the search parameters that it was, the top hits, top number of views. And the one that came up, if I remember correctly, it was a Rupert Spira video. And the title of it was, "You Were Never Born and You Will Never Die." That to me is straight up eternalism. You were never born and you will never die. And I've heard Rupert Spira talk more about how, when you die, your consciousness is just like a drop of water that will return to the ocean of consciousness. And my question for Rupert Spira is, how do you know that? Like, how do you know how the universe works? I don't. I'll be the first one to admit I have no idea the universe works. I try not to make strong claims like that because I just don't know. But let's unpack this phrase: "You were never born. You will never die." I think perhaps what he means by that is from the subjective perception of consciousness. You can't actually experience your own birth. I mean, people might argue that, right? Some people argue that you have birth trauma, that it maybe is unconscious. Perhaps. But usually, if you think back to, you can't actually access the moment when your consciousness came online. And remember that, because, it's just at some point you just have a memory, right? Your earliest memory, whatever that is. And you could argue that you can't actually experience your own death, right? Because if death is the end of consciousness, from one perspective, you are not there for it, right? So I kind of get what that statement is perhaps hinting at. But I think the reason it resonates so strongly with people is it really plays into that thread of salvation, right? It sounds actually very Christian. You will never born, you will never die. I've seen some Christian slogans around here where I live that say things like, true love lasts forever. It's pointing you to a website, a Christian website. But actually, it sounds pretty similar to a lot of non-dual rhetoric around you were never born, you will never die. So it's part of this kind of immortality project, this eternalism, this, I think that impermanence and death, the decay of this body is very, very haunting, as a human being. And again, since we're wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain, I think that this language that presents some kind of escape, not the escape of oblivion that the Buddha was seeking, but actually an escape from our corporeality, escape from impermanence into something eternal, right? This idea of, my consciousness will continue after I'm gone, in some form, even if it's an oceanic form. I'm still going to be there. I'm still going to be there eternally, forever. Very, very comforting. So of course, it's part of Sellvation, right? When teachers say things like this, it really strikes a chord, and it's a very great way to get followers and to sell retreats, because who doesn't want to, at some way, live forever or feel like you're eternal or feel like you are divine? But my question is, how do you know that's true? And I can't say ultimately for sure one way or the other. I try to be humble about that. I hope it's clear that I'm not claiming that I have some ultimate knowledge, but I just think it's good to just be, just keep asking questions, because, nobody knows. And I think that, I think the problem with eternalism is it keeps us from accessing what's there under the surface, which are these fears about our mortality and fears about loss and about death and decay and impermanence. And I think, in my experience, actually connecting with those things and making space for them is much more healing than chasing after some sort of eternalist escape from them. So the last myth of awakening that I want to touch upon before I move on into some concluding remarks, it comes from Goenka. At some point I was into Goenka, did a Goenka retreat. And for those of you who don't know Goenka, he's a very renowned Vipassana teacher. And he had this catchphrase: as it is, not as you want it to be. As it is, not as you want it to be. Very interesting and compelling statement. I think it probably has Taoist roots. Within Daoism, there is this notion of the way, the great way. Again, kind of like the Xin Xin Ming. The great way is not difficult, for those who don't make distinctions. So there's some sense there of there is a way of nature, a way that things are, a sort of natural flow of things. But then there is within that this kind of separate offshoot of that, this bad program, this kind of excrescence, this kind of like wart, kind of within that is the human will, which is wanting things to be a certain way that are different than the way things are. And so within that kind of framing, that kind of Taoist framing, which I think Goenka is influenced by, I believe, I'm not sure, there's some sense of, okay, so that is what enlightenment is it's recognizing that there is a natural way of things, a way of nature, and then this human will, this ego, is somehow in opposition to that. So our task spiritually then is to collapse the ego, collapse the self, and sort of dissolve into the flow of nature, right? And I want to make the critique that I think that's actually incredibly dualistic, because it's saying that there is a way of nature and there's a way of, the human being that is somehow at odds with that, and that the one needs to collapse into the other. What if, just hear me out here, what if being human is also part of nature? What if nature gave us our emotions and our desires and our impulses and our will, and that is already part of this unity of just what is happening, the experience of being a human being? What if it's already kind of integrated in that way? And what if then our task spiritually is not to try to suppress or repress the way we want things to be, or our will and so forth and so on. But what if it's just noticing these reactions and connecting with them as just part of our natural experience? So we're not so attached to them, we're not clinging to them so tightly, but we're just observing them as a natural kind of flow, including our will, our desires, our attachments, things like that. And just recognizing that that's just part of our humanity. In case this is unclear, I want to illustrate this with an anecdote. So let's just say that you one day go out and notice that let's say you try to start your car and your car is broken. There's like smoke coming out from the hood, some kind of catastrophic issue, probably very expensive issue with your car. I would say that according to different myths of enlightenment, you might expect various reactions there. So let's just say, according to one myth of enlightenment, which would be that you have zero negative emotions, right? So according to that myth that we've talked about earlier, then you would say, oh, well, somebody who's enlightened is not going to have any feelings about that whatsoever. They're just going to be completely blissfully serene. It's not going to bother them at all. And it doesn't matter that the car has broken down, because they're just going to be floating on a cloud of bliss. That would be one kind of model of enlightenment, which, as I've said before, I think is unrealistic, untrue, doesn't seem to happen. I don't know anybody who's like that, including very awakened people who have done thousands of hours of meditation. But that is one sort of myth of enlightenment. Another would be a little bit more softer and say, okay, maybe the body mind will kind of get upset. There will be some kind of energetic arising, but it will be kind of delicious and you will be free. So there's a sense of you might have emotions, but they're not going to be any kind of problem whatsoever, and you will still have this kind of enduring, spacious kind of freedom within that. And then there's, the third version of this, which this is where I stand on this, and I think hopefully more realistic and more human, is that, you might have some greater connection with your emotions and your body as energy. You might have spaciousness, right, with it in this kind of non-dual sense. And so in the sense that, the emotions might rise up and kind of come through your experience of awareness, of consciousness, and it might not bind you as much, right? You might not contract around it as much. But there might still be part of you that is still resisting, right? That you still would prefer that your car would start. And so there is some kind of suffering there. It's not just pure, effortless, frictionless, energetic kind of energy that's just transmuted into some kind of bliss, or some kind of tantric bliss experience of these frustrating emotions. That there is some part of you that is just plain frustrated, and you just want your car to start because you need to get where you're trying to get to. So that's kind of how I think of it. I think that the first model of just having no negative emotions whatsoever, very unrealistic. The second is sort of getting a little more realistic, but I think is still looking through human emotions with the rose-colored glasses. And I still think there's a lot of rhetoric out there within non-duality circles and enlightenment circles that do kind of try to take this pseudo middle ground of saying, oh yeah, you're going to have emotions, but it's still framed as, and you're still not going to suffer. You're going to have the full range of emotions, but you're going to have zero suffering. Emotions as energy, as space, as kind of love and light, even anger, even sadness, it's all going to be love and light. And so you'll have emotions, but you're not going to suffer. I still think that's very unrealistic. I don't know anybody who actually works that way. And again, it's just a denial of our human experience. Like, what's wrong with having some core feeling that is some kind of resistance? And again, it gets to this sort of split of as it is, not as you want it to be. The human way versus the great way. That there's something in us that is wrong, is bad. It's almost like a kind of original sin or something like that. That to have some kind of resistance to life is inherently some kind of problem, some kind of bad program that needs to be deleted. And what if we can just notice that that's just part of our experience? And in fact, the more you just notice it, the more it tends to relax on its own. If you try to fight with it or cut it off or pretend it's not there or pretend that you can just have emotions without having resistance to life, that tends to get people very, very stuck in my experience. So I hope that's kind of helpful. That's kind of how I think of it. And again, I present all this because I hope it just provides a more balanced, realistic way of going through an awakening process that's more integrated and it just gives you some encouragement that it's okay to be human. It's okay to have normal emotions. So I want to start wrapping up here. And one thought that's on my mind as I'm concluding is another podcast that I'll also link to in the show notes that I heard with teacher Roger Thisdell, who is very, very experienced, advanced meditator, seems to be a very realized person. And he makes the claim, which I think is really interesting, that perhaps we are always suffering. What he says is, in my experience as a meditator, I've been through so many, subtle states of exquisite bliss, through jhanas, through psychedelic states with MDMA, and so forth and so on. And I've always found that insofar as I was conscious, there was still some, even very subtle feeling of contraction or resistance or clinging or craving or preference or something like that. And so there was still some suffering there. And so he kind of makes the hypothesis that perhaps just to be a human being, a conscious being in a body, in a nervous system, there is just some kind of baseline, almost like background radiation of suffering that's just always there. And I think that's a really interesting hypothesis. I think it's, and so you might say perhaps like the goal of the spiritual path is to eliminate or let go of as much suffering as you can to get to the point where you're just experiencing that baseline level of suffering. That would be one sort of take on it. And I think Roger Thisdell is maybe coming from that camp. I like that because it acknowledges that it's actually impossible to eliminate suffering completely, which I think is different than what a lot of other spiritual teachers say, where there is this sense of, I am free of suffering, or you will get to some point where you're completely free of suffering. Roger, keeps it real, and he's like, that's not my experience. And in fact, I think you're always suffering. So I think that's really interesting. I wanted to put that out there because I think it actually provides some kind of letting go or relief from this whole project of you have to get to some point where you don't suffer. Or if you're still suffering in any kind of way whatsoever, you're not awake yet. Roger's just calling bullshit on that, basically, and saying there is no escape from suffering in this lifetime. He says the only escape is cessation, right? So, which actually is a non-experience. So when you're in cessation, you are not conscious, right? So you can't actually consciously experience a lack of suffering. So that's an interesting way of thinking about awakening. Is maybe awakening perhaps is not about the end of suffering, but about just getting more and more in touch with our direct experience so that the suffering falls away to the point where most of what's left is just this kind of baseline level. So you're kind of minimizing suffering. You're not eliminating it, you're minimizing it. That would be one way of thinking about awakening, which I think is pretty compelling. And another way of thinking about it, which I often explore, is what if awakening has absolutely nothing to do with suffering at all? What if that? That's kind of interesting. And I've shared about this in other videos and interviews, but I think for me, awakening was all about suffering for a really long time. And then at some point, I was suffering so much, especially with my Lyme disease, that something in me broke. And I just started to change my relationship with awakening. And it became not about suffering or alleviating suffering. It became much more about just what's my experience right now? What's my experience right now? It really lowers the stakes, right? It kind of takes the pressure off because then you don't have to be in any particular state. There's not any particular goal, any kind of, soteriological end, some kind of expectation in your experience to be in a particular way. There's not some kind of hedonic target that you're aiming at. It's just like, this is what's happening. And maybe you are suffering, and that's okay. So that's kind of interesting for me in terms of an awakening phase that I've been exploring, where Sellvation, the reduction of suffering, it's not even part of it. And, I could imagine some people hearing that and saying, but Mira, come on, that's not fair. Cause like so many people are really, really suffering and you've had the chance to like do all these psychedelics and have all these years of meditation. So it's very rich of you to say it's not about suffering, but what about the rest of us? I hear that. And I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, I think that these practices of meditation, work with psychedelics, these insights and openings, they absolutely do reduce suffering significantly. And I'd be lying if I didn't say that. But I also wish, honestly, that somebody had told me a long, long time ago, Mira, don't make it about the end of suffering. Make it about just connecting with your experience. Because if you do that, then the suffering starts to melt away just naturally, kind of as a side effect. And I have to be careful when I say that, because sometimes people hear that and they'll say, oh, I see. Now Mira is telling me like the secret hacks of the real, escape from suffering is I just have to not worry about suffering and not make it the end of suffering the goal, and then it'll actually end. It's like, no, that'll just keep the wheel of craving, the end of suffering turning. It's not really about that. It's just that, I guess one way to describe it is I have so many clients come into my practice and they tell me like, I'm so frustrated because I really want to be more peaceful. I really want to be more happy. I really want to be more loving. I really want to connect more with my kids. And I also want to have more contact with non-duality. I want to be more free and more spacious and et cetera, et cetera. But I'm not, I struggle. I have these like thoughts that loop around and get stuck, and I get frustrated and angry. And what I tell them is, think about it this way. It's like you have this compass that's guiding your spiritual kind of practice, this compass needle, and it's pointing to where you want to get to. And if the compass needle is always pointing to some kind of future imagined state, then you're never going to get there, right? Like there's always that kind of displacement between where you are now and where you want to get to. And definitionally, that by default, like keeps seeking going, right? Because seeking by definition is I have a point A and I have a point B. So if your compass needle is always pointed at some imagined point B, you always will be seeking. So what I tell people is, what's it like to turn the compass needle around and just have it point to right here, right now? What are you actually experiencing? What are you actually experiencing? And for that to include everything, right? To include everything. What I'm actually experiencing. Maybe I'm actually experiencing that I'm pissed, that I'm frustrated, that I'm angry, that I'm, in conflict with, someone, or I'm ruminating about something, or I'm, in resistance to life or this role I have at work or as a parent or whatever. That is what is happening. And what's it like to just feel into that as deeply as possible, feel into it in your body. And we can also connect with the whole sensorium in that sort of non-dual sense of giving it space, connecting and being present with it. And then it's not about having any particular state of mind or any particular hedonic state of bliss or peace. It's just about being with the experience, right? And so I share this as a word of encouragement to people, because honestly, it breaks my heart when people get sucked into this Sellvation kind of tractor beam, and they're paying these teachers like, all this money to go on these retreats over and over again, and they're stuck in these loops of seeking because the teacher is always holding aloft this model of enlightenment that is impossible, because they're exaggerating their own experience, because they're talking about some kind of no self, some kind of end of suffering that just like doesn't exist for anyone. It doesn't exist for them. And they're misrepresenting it. It's a very effective strategy to make a lot of money and to get a lot of followers. And I think it's very deeply toxic and unethical. And what I want to say to you is, if you are seeking in that sense, give yourself a break. It doesn't exist. Enlightenment is a myth. The Buddha was never enlightened. Jesus never walked on water. Sorry. I mean, I don't know for sure again, but I don't think so. What I do think is that people are human. I think that our bodies grow old, they decay, they die. I think we have pain. I think we have suffering. And I think that ultimately nobody knows what the hell is going on, including me. I don't know the nature of the self. I don't know the nature of reality. I don't know the nature of the universe. I don't even know what awakening is. I like to shift the pendulum from awakening being all about the end of suffering to awakening being more about just like, what's your direct, authentic experience right now? What's your honest experience? To me, that's a huge relief. And it actually reduces suffering a lot to do that, I would say. But then at a deeper level, that's still kind of construct because I don't know what awakening is. And it's just, yeah, I guess I can just say I don't know what it is. It's sort of what's happening right now, the mystery of this moment, the nature of that, the direction of that, the end of that, the purpose of that, couldn't tell you. And that's just my honest, humble confession, really, is that, I don't have any secrets here. Like, I don't know. And, I'll say for myself that my experience of deepening into that kind of not knowing as a practice, as a dance, has been very compelling and has been very refreshing for me. And I wouldn't want it any other way. And I probably couldn't anyway, because it's just what's happening, right? That's sort of the point. It doesn't appear to be any kind of control. So yeah, I was talking with a client about this sort of stuff the other day, and I said to him, it's kind of like I spent a lot of my life, it's like there was music playing and there was like a dance going on, but I had this physics textbook out, and I kept kind of like looking in the physics textbook, trying to figure out, well, how to, what's the vectors and the right, footwork to dance in this particular way, and the angular momentum and all this sort of stuff. And at some point I just finally like put the book down and started dancing. And that's a lot of what this awakening process feels like. It's like somehow these mechanisms that we have in place in our mind that are all about constantly creating these kind of expectations and these like needs to like figure things out and have some kind of definition, some direction, some particular state, some particular goal, some kind of win, is really like falling away. I don't think it all ever falls away completely. That's part of what's happening too. It keeps coming back, but there's definitely a kind of putting down of the textbook and getting out on the dance floor and just kind of, just starting to merge with this mystery of the experience as it's unfolding. And I don't know what awakening is about, but that's sort of my best description experientially of what seems to be happening. So anyway, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for listening. And I really hope this was helpful. My intention here is to be encouraging and to, just kind of take the weight off your shoulders of this whole Capital-E Enlightenment thing. I honestly think it's really harmful. It's a huge weight. And I think there's a much more human way to go through this process. So I hope this was helpful, and perhaps even healing for you to hear, encouraging. And if you found this inspiring, consider liking and subscribing to the channel. I'm really trying to get my channel. I want to remove ads from this channel, and you can't do that unless you are part of YouTube's partner program. And then you can demonetize and turn monetization off. But you have to get to 1,000 subscribers first. So I'm trying to get to the 1,000 so I can enter that program, turn off the monetization. Then I'll have 0 ads, because I really don't want ads on this channel. I find them very interruptive. I want my work to be very fluid and expansive and meditative, and I don't like that interruption for people's experience. So if you can subscribe, it'll help me get there, and then I can take the ads off. And I'd appreciate if you would rate this podcast on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. That helps it find more people. If you give it a 5-star rating. If you want to connect with me and see what else is going on with my work, go to my website, unjourneying.com. And if you're interested in joining my Patreon community, you can visit patreon.com/unjourneying. Thank you so much.